Welcome to section 14, and the main focus of this particular section is entity framework relationships, how our tables in our database are going to relate to each other. Now that we have two entities, we've got an activity entity and a user entity, and they're going to need to relate to each other because our users are going to be able to attend activities. So let's take a look at the learning goals for this section, and of course we're going to take a look at entity framework relationships. We're going to take a look at loading related entities because by default, Entity Framework is not going to load related data for any entity unless we specifically ask it to. And there's a few different approaches to doing this, and we'll take a look at those, and we'll also take a look at something called Automapper Queryable Extensions, which gives us a way to project out of our database into a different object than our entity. And it's pretty cool. And we'll also take a look at adding an infrastructure project in this section as well, and I'll explain why very shortly. So if we take a look at the different types of relationships we can have with our entities, then the simplest example would be a one-to-one relationship where a user could have an address object, and our address object or entity could have a street name, a town, a city, etc. And each user would have one address, so there'd be a one-to-one relationship. We can also have one-to-many relationships, so not in this section, but in a coming up section, we're going to add the ability for the user to add photos, and each user could have many photos. So that would be an example of a one-to-many relationship. And there's also a many-to-many relationship, so our user can attend many activities. And our activities can have many attendees, which are going to be our users. And this is an example of a many-to-many relationship. Now, Entity Framework is pretty good at the previous two by convention. We'll add, in the example of the user and the photos, we would add a collection of photos, and Entity Framework would work out the relationship and say, aha, we need a foreign key going from our photos collection to our user. And it would be able to configure the migration and would scaffold our database and everything would be good. Many-to-many relationships is kind of a recent addition to Entity Framework. And by convention, we can now configure this relationship just by adding in our activity a collection of users and in our user a collection of activities, and Entity Framework can now work out that relationship. But what it does, regardless, is we need to create a join table in our database to relate these two tables together. And in this way, we would have a table called user activities, and our activities would have a one-to-many relationship with this, and our user would have a one-to-many relationship with the user activities table. And if we take a look at an example of a many-to-many join table, then our user activities table would have a primary key that's made up of a combination of the app user ID and the activity ID, and it would have a foreign key related to the activity ID in the activities table, and a foreign key related to the ASP.NET users table, the ID from there as well. Now, what we're going to do in our application, and this diagram does show an example of the reason for possibly creating our own join table rather than relying on conventions, and we will take a look at the conventional or Entity Framework conventions to do this for us. But by creating our own join table, we can actually add additional properties to this for things that we might want to track that are not easy to track in either our users table or our activities table. And for example, if we wanted to track the date the user joined an activity, or if the user is the host of the activity, then we've got no easy way to do that inside either our users table or our activities table, but it is easy to track that in our join table. So that's the approach we'll take in our many-to-many relationship. What we'll also be doing in this section is introducing a new project into our application. And that's going to raise our project count to 5 in our .NET Framework projects. And why are we going to do this? Well, let's go back to our clean architecture diagram that we've looked at a few times so far in this course. And if we think about the use cases, once again, our use cases where all of our business logic is located. Now, our application layer doesn't know about authentication. It's on an outside circle. It's in as part of our API project in the green layer. So our application project in the use cases layer has no idea about authentication. But when it comes to creating activities, what we're going to want to do is add attendees to those activities, and those activities are going to be users. And when a user joins an activity, we need to make sure that that user is who they say they are. And the way that we can do that is by getting the token and interrogating that token and getting the username from that token. And then we can use that username to go and get the user that we want to add to that activity attendees list. So where does the infrastructure project we're going to create fit in? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create this project, and this project is going to be outside of anything else in our application. And it's going to have a dependency on the application project. It's going to have access to the classes we create in our application layer. And it's outside of our application. So dependencies go inwards. But we are working with .NET Framework, and we do have a startup project in our API. So our API isn't just an API, it's also our startup project, and it also contains our dependency injection container. So we're going to have a dependency going from our API to our infrastructure project, and the reason for that is so that when we create services inside our infrastructure project, we can add them to our dependency injection container in our API. So let's take a look at what our infrastructure project is going to be responsible for initially. So our infrastructure project is going to have a dependency on our application, but our application does not have a dependency on the infrastructure. So for that reason, we're going to create an interface inside our application layer that allows us to get a user's username. But the implementation class is going to be held in our user accessor. And in our infrastructure projects, we're going to have access to the HTTP context. We're going to go and get the token from inside the claims principal from the HTTP context, and that's going to be our implementation class. In our application class, all we're going to have is an interface with get username. Now, our application is going to have no idea how this is implemented. It doesn't know anything about the HTTP context, and it certainly doesn't know what a token is, but it's going to have the ability to go and get the username using an interface. And the idea is really that our application layer, the logic inside there, should not change if we change the method of authentication. If we swapped our API project for a console type of project, then we wouldn't have an HTTP context to go and get a token from. We would be using an entirely different method to authenticate even. But regardless, the iUser accessor and the logic in there, the get username, should just be responsible for getting a username. And then in the infrastructure, if we wanted to change the implementation, because we were changing from an API to a console project, then we would change it in the implementation class, but our application logic never changes. All we want is the ability to get a username inside there. So anyway, this is what we're going to be building, and it should become clearer as we build out what we're doing here. But let's take a look at the before and after. And if we take a look at where we're currently at, then in our activities, for example, then all we can do is just get a list of our activities. And that's where we are right now. But after this section, we're going to have the ability to add attendances to our activities. And when we get a list of our activities, we're going to see the relations that we're going to send back with our activities in the form of the attendees, the users that are attending specific activities. And for each activity, we'll have a collection of attendees that are going. And of course, we'll provide the functionality for users to add their attendance, remove their attendance from an activity, as well as the host will be able to actually cancel the activity as well. And this is what's coming up.